that self-disclosure, especially on the part of the group leader, when that tips the scales into asking others to take care of you, that is the point where it is always inappropriate. There are other points where it may be inappropriate, and it's kind of case by case. I would say just ask of yourself, is this the only way that I can get my point across? Is this the only way of like moving this session forward right now? Or are there better ways of doing it? Because especially, okay, like if you're within a peer group, you don't know if you'll see those people again. You don't know if they're gonna like have some other role in your life. But if you're a group leader, you want to model for people that it's okay to not share if they don't feel like sharing. You also want to model for people that there's like levels of trust that are appropriate with others, and we shouldn't just blindly trust everybody with all of our deep dark secrets. It's okay to make some disclosures. It's also you need to measure whether or not you might be triggering someone. So for example, if I was leading a group that was for survivors of sexual assault, and I decided to share that I had survived a sexual assault, I would probably just use the words, I survived a sexual assault, instead of giving people the scenario and details of that assault, right? I find this happens a lot within like addiction recovery and with assault like community, where people, they feel the need to share their story, but sometimes other people in your group may not be ready to hear those details. Those details might be very close to the details of their own story. And then they're kind of reliving that moment, and they're not in a headspace where they can feel safe and grow. So be careful with that, especially if you're telling kind of like rock bottom stories like that. That can be really upsetting for people. It also sometimes establishes like a false norm that you have to tell that story, or that there's like a one-upping, like this mine was worse than yours, and you just don't want that ever. So yeah, be careful with self-disclosure. Um, Saying I know we can help you, I don't know we can help you. I don't know if a comet is going to hit my building next week. Like, I hope we can. These are what I would probably say is like, these are the types of things that people tend to do better on after this group is concluded, if I've already done the group. Or I could say, these are the types of people and the types of problems that tend to work best in this group. So this is like, you seem like you would fit that, and I have every hope. You can say things like that for sure. Or like, it's up to you how much effort you want to put into this. The more effort you put in, the more likely you will be to see results. Saying things like, what I think doesn't matter. This goes again, like the neither like or dislike you. What you think is conveyed to everyone, even if you don't say it explicitly. A lot of your viewpoints will be inferred by your actions and your nonverbals and a lot of things. And everybody in this group will be treated equally. Same thing as kind of the I neither like or dislike you. Also, there's a difference between equality and equity. So like if one person comes in the group and they are taking up a lot of time every single day, then it's appropriate for the group leader to ask that person to step back. Now, they're not being treated equally. They're being treated equitably, because we are making sure that everyone has like an equal stake and equal time. Other people didn't get reprimanded for it because they didn't have that problem. You know what I'm saying? So if someone has a problem, you have to address it. That's not part of unequal treatment. That's just part of like equitable space sharing. All right, so ethical problem solving. I feel like we talk a lot about ethics, and then we don't talk about like, what do you do when something happens, like something that's an ethical concern. And in reality, it's not like you have like an ethical problem and then you just screw up and you lose your license and you're done forever, because there would be no social workers ever. If that was true, that's not true. So there's always like a problem solving process. Essentially, you're going to want to talk about it in supervision. You're going to want to consult your code of ethics, your ethical standard, the policies at your agency, whatever laws may come into play if it's of that level. And then you're just going to kind of like talk through different potential responses. And ideally, if this is like an ethical situation that's concerning you, it's probably a good idea to consult more than one person. So maybe like your supervisor at work, and then like a supervision group or like a peer group. So you have a couple of different responses, and you want to at some point kind of like involve your NASW code of ethics in there, because that's your license specifically. So you're going to just kind of like play out let's see what would happen if I did this. Let's see what would happen if I did this. And then you're going to find what you think is the best conclusion, the best course of action. You're going to process that with your peers as you're implementing it. So you don't just have a one and done conversation and then go off and do it. You want to follow up with peers and with your supervisor about, okay, so this person made a racist comment last week. I took them aside. I told them that that wasn't acceptable. And then they made another one this week. So what we're going to do is we're going to like have them on like a warning, and we're going to like talk about it as a group and process it. And then we're going to follow up with that. And then you just kind of like keep following up until the problem seems to be resolved. So then you also want to document. And when you're documenting, I would suggest if you meet with a supervisor, like your licensing supervisor, you might want to have a separate record of your supervision sessions that doesn't go into the case note. You probably should also put in the case note, like consulted with supervision, and then say what the supervisor said. But this is kind of an off chance, but if you're ever called before the board, you might not have access to client records because those belong to your agency. They don't belong to you. So, or if you are fired from your job because you did something that was unethical, then you won't have access to those records. So what you want is just to have like your own record. I would keep it probably like password protected, like a Google Doc, and don't use people's first and last names, like maybe use initials, and just like talk about the process, like the ethical decision-making model that you did, just so that you can have that proof if that ever happens to you. I think it's good to note too that like when people do get called before the board usually gives them chances to rectify the situation. They don't just snap, take away your license, right? Okay, so diverse groups. All groups are diverse. There's diversity within like, what do you call it? Homogeneity. That's probably not a word. Homogeneity, something like that. Okay, so there's a difference though. There's, we can talk about de jure discrimination and de facto discrimination. So de jure discrimination is like legal, right? So like some people cannot receive government benefits because they are not a citizen of the United States. That is de jure discrimination of non-citizens, okay? Like LGBT marriage, mostly it's legal, but then there was like, of course, the years where it wasn't legal, and then there's like some gray areas still in certain states. So de facto discrimination is much more insidious, much more difficult to deal with. It's kind of like what actually exists, whether or not it's upheld by the law, like hate crimes happening, or like people using racial slurs, city segregation like zoning, or having certain districts where there's a lot of policing, the policing is unfair, things like this. Much harder to prove, much more insidious. This is the kind that we're going to want to really pay attention to in our groups, because that's the kind that's like the microaggressions are happening, where you want to actually pay attention, because that's going to disturb your group process. You would probably know if there was de jure discrimination happening within your group. That would be like easy and figured out pretty quickly. So these are just different ways that that can happen. Like stereotypes, preconceptions, we all have them. We can't pretend that we just like come into a group as like a newborn baby and have no way of seeing color or anything. We see that, we have ideas about it. And so your upbringing, your personal experience are going to influence what that looks like for you, especially if you've had like specific experiences with certain groups of people over other groups of people. Also, especially if you're a white person, you've probably been conditioned to never talk about race, or to talk about it in terms of the other person's race and not about you being white. So that's something that just like notice being uncomfortable if you are having to talk about it, or if people in your group are talking about it, just notice it. That's all you can do, is like start to notice, start to work on, start to process, right? I'd say as a rule of thumb, use the client's own word for their identity, and then check with them before you say it. That's just kind of best practices. And also that's something that can kind of like go along with the times. I had students ask like, how do you keep up with like the words that people want to use? And I'm like, you just have to kind of have an open mind at all times, that like a client's probably going to use a word for their identity at some point that you've never heard before. And you can just say, I don't know that word. Can you explain that to me? And like thank them for explaining it to you. Yes, it's not the job of the client to explain their identity and explain their race to us. However, like there's kind of a point where if the client says a word that you don't know, you probably should ask them what they mean, because you want to know what it means to them. You should Google stuff on your own, but ask people what the word means in the context they're using it, so you know what they mean, right? Don't assume people's religions, language, other things like that based on their race or ethnicity. Even if you've worked with 400,000 people who are all the same racial group, all the same ethnic group, and they all say the same religion, there could be one person who isn't, and you don't want to assume. So just ask everybody the same questions, right? And yeah, people have multiple identities that exist and some are invisible. So we just want to be aware of that, that like that plays out within the group context. If like maybe someone in the group has or they don't have an identity, but like they have a loved one, right? Maybe they have like a loved one with a chronic illness or like a disability, and then there's people in the group who are talking about that. We can't see that anyone in the group is affected by that or has a personal like stake in that, but they do, right? So we just want to be like kind of conscious of all that. And then this has been controversial in some of my other classes, but I would say in my personal experience, do not use kids as translators unless there's absolutely no other way to get a service done for the person. I would say this because so there's this idea called parentification when a kid is asked to do a task that's beyond their like mental and emotional capacity. Um, Kids want to be helpful to their parents. They want to be liked. They want to be loved. They want to be important. But sometimes if a kid is put in the position of being a translator in a social work context, they are forced to like do things like give their parents bad news or translate extremely complicated concepts, and then they feel a lot of like anxiety and apprehension that they're not doing it correctly. And for me, I never want to put a kid in that position, so I would always advocate, if you're at an agency where they're doing that, I would advocate for funding to hire a professional translator. That's also giving work to the people who are qualified. But I'll just give an example. I used to do this a lot. So working with people in public benefits, a lot of times we would have immigrant and refugee groups that were very, very small groups in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. So maybe like 15 families speak this language, right? And it's maybe like an ethnic minority group of a certain country. And so we would have a kid come in and be like, here, I'm here to translate for my dad. Well, that seems to be fine when it's just like, hey, this is the program, here's a bus card, things like that. But the problem comes up, like we would have people go into what we called non-compliance. So we would have like the parents would come in and we had to tell them that their file was being closed, which meant that they were not getting cash assistance anymore. Now we have a 7-year-old explaining that to their parents. Parents are crying, 7-year-old feels responsible. Like that's the kind of situation that I don't feel is ethical for us to be doing. Now, if you are in a family and you translate documents for like your grandmother or your aunt or your uncle or your cousin or whatever, that's your choice and you're an adult. But I would say, especially under the age of like 11, probably kids are not emotionally mature enough to handle like a social services type of meeting, especially if it's something like child protection or public benefits, where there's a potential that something could be very like upsetting. That's news that's being delivered. I would stay away from that. So try and pay people when you can. So just thinking about diversity, most systems in the US use these defaults. So this is kind of like a way of thinking about it that I like to look at. It's just like we have this idea that there is a sort of default person. And that's who our services are generally designed for. So if our client is not in any of these ways like a default person or like fake default, then there's probably going to be a misfit in some way of how the services work for them. So like most systems in the US assume that a person is white. Like Band-Aids. Band-Aids, well, actually, Band-Aids are the color of no one's skin, but they're closer to white skin than brown skin. Straight, we look at adoption laws, we look at marriage laws, we look at like LGBT rights. Cisgender, that means like identifying with the gender that's on their birth certificate. So we look at bathroom bills and those kinds of things that are coming out across the US. A lot of them use male as default. If you don't think that that's true, you should read your HR handbook and see how many of the dress code things only apply to women, because we are obsessed with telling women what to put on their bodies. Without children, I would say a lot of our systems are designed, even weirdly, like even systems that are hypothetically designed for people who have children, I found are not really designed for people with children. Like the public benefits structure that we had, we'd have to have people meet with us like once a day, or not once a day, that would be a lot. It was once a month, but it was like during regular business hours and they were hypothetically supposed to be